Good afternoon. My name is Wang, and I'm honored to be here today to moderate this panel discussion on overcoming some of the challenges and fears associated with the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. The idea behind this panel kind of started about 5 years ago when I accepted my current position at Ascent Funding. Ascent is a nonprofit organization that makes business loans and offers capital coaching to minority and women-owned businesses. And so by accepting the position, I was immediately thrust into the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion work focused on access to capital. Even though I was extremely excited about the opportunity, I also had some apprehensions. And the reason why is that up until then, I rarely worked with people of color. Organizations that I worked in, the business that I had for about 10 years, our employees, my colleagues, clients, suppliers, partners, very few of them were people of color. So when I started the job, I got nervous, I got apprehensive. I was reporting to a board that was very diverse, and I started wondering, what if we have different management styles, leadership styles, communication styles, and what if we didn't kind of sync up with each other? I remember going to my first networking meeting with Black business owners and being very apprehensive about it because I didn't know anybody. I didn't know if I would be accepted into the group. I also just, in general meetings, just was afraid sometimes to say something because I might I might offend someone, or I might, do some body language that might rub someone the wrong way. So, and I know, now that I've done this for about 5 years, I know that this work, these feelings, it's common, and I suspect many of you in this audience have those, concerns or questions. So I'm excited to be here with, these wonderful panelists today, and in a few moments they'll introduce themselves. And, our objective of this session today is kind of share with you some of our experiences in doing this diversity, equity, inclusion work. And, say it's okay to have some of these concerns. It's okay to have some of these fears. But we want to be able to share with you our experiences and, help you, understand what's involved, help you, give you the tools, the resources, and the tips so that you can overcome whatever barriers that you may have or your organization may have so that you can pursue this work that's really needed, for our organizations and for our society. So in a few moments, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. The layout of this session today is that, after the introductions, we'll have about half an hour or so of conversations, and then we'll open it up for 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A, and then just kind of wrap up with some comments. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Kristin, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Robin. My name is Kristin Bowers. I work at the Revelry Group, which is a B Corp here in Portland, focused on marketing communications primarily. I do most of my equity, diversity, and inclusion work in Portland on a volunteer basis. Prior to moving here a year and a half ago, I was a full-time diversity, equity, and inclusion manager for a large AmLaw 100 law firm specializing in labor and employment, which has its own set of challenges when it comes to EDI in particular. So I'm excited to share, coming in as the first diversity professional they had there, and someone who didn't have a background in that space, some of my experiences accordingly.
Dr. Chang?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. It's great to be here. What an interesting day, and so many of you bringing all of your positive energy and celebrating this B Corp community. So I'm Ruth Chang. I'm a family physician, and I serve as the Chief People Officer for Northwest Permanente. And Northwest Permanente is the largest medical group in this geographic area. So we partner with Kaiser Foundation Health Plan, and together we're a Kaiser Permanente health plan. So we care for over 620,000 people in this Southwest Washington, Northwest Oregon geographic footprint, all the way from Longview, Kelso down to Eugene. And in our medical group, we have 1,700, so about 1,400 clinicians, physicians and clinicians, and 300 non-clinical administrative staff. So as the Chief People Officer, my friends who are really into Star Wars joke that I should be the C-3PO, because so the 3 Ps I'm in charge of are people, so how do we recruit and retain and engage the best people that we can find? And then problems, so when issues arise, it comes to me. And the third one is, importantly, parties. How do we celebrate and recognize the great work that we're doing? And so I'm thrilled to be here as part of the panel on equity, inclusion, and diversity.
Thank you. Camille?
Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Elmore-Trummer. I am an account manager at Brink Communications. Brink is a woman-owned, full-scale communications design and marketing firm. We're in Revolution Hall on 14th and Stark. We work at the intersections of urban innovation, public health, and racial and social justice. Those are the vehicles by which we work in, and we never stray from those. As an account manager and also a community engagement strategist, I have been working across communities to reduce harm, and so a part of my DEI strategy is always facilitating meaningful conversations and leaving people equipped with strategies that they can implement to advance our work, because it is very critical. So I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you. So we're going to just jump into it, and the first question I have for the three of you is, DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work, can be uncomfortable, right? And I want to ask you, why is it uncomfortable, and what have you experienced, or what have you heard in your experiences, and what advice can you offer to overcome that uncomfortness? So I started last time over there, so I'll start with you, Camille.
Okay. Why is DEI uncomfortable? Well, one thought is because it's a direct response to inequity, right? So that in of itself invoke some discomfort. And so one of the things that I always think about is, how do we flip that framework on its head and think of DEI as an opportunity? It's an opportunity to improve the way that we communicate with one another and understand one another and interact with one another. It's also an opportunity to improve our society as a whole, to celebrate and recognize difference and create spaces and places by which people who embody difference can feel comfortable being in those places and spaces. So some advice that I would have, I've heard many things. I've heard that it's hard to broach the subject, that people that don't have those same lived experiences as people of color or LGBTQ folks or differently abled people, et cetera, they can't speak to DEI work because they don't live it. I would say to that, my advice is that we all need to accept that we are all different. So accepting and acknowledging is that first baby step. We have to accept that there are inequalities that we are living in and perpetuating every single day. We all participate in that process, in that system. It's been designed that way. So once we acknowledge it and accept it, we're able to think through strategies that are relevant to our work, to our workspaces, to our places, to our families, our homes, around the dinner table, that we can actually implement to advance this work, to dismantle the same inequities that we're trying to respond to as a part of this DEI strategy, right? So my advice is, how are you going to interrogate gracefully your organization to bring up the types of questions that allow you to acknowledge and accept that the dynamics are set up in a way that is causing implications or causing harm for some people? And then the next step is, what are you going to do about it? And how are you going to do it? So I think that very first step, that advice I have, is the interrogation process. Ask some questions of yourself first, and of your organization, if you have the opportunity in the space to facilitate that type of conversation.
So going to what Camille was saying, I definitely had experienced a lot of the fears and challenges of coming into the DEI space, not being diverse myself. So I understand kind of that struggle of, where do I start? Am I going to say the wrong thing? Where are we going to go next with this? I'm not going to lie and say it wasn't incredibly terrifying. It was. But at the same time, the approach that I took regarding moving across that sort of internal barrier for me was just learning, education, and focusing on process, and finding allies in the diversity space within my organization and externally. So really trying to connect with the community, learn from everyone I talk to, recognize that as Nina said, if any of you were in her presentation earlier, you're going to step in it, and I did a lot and still do. But at the same time, it's just continuing to move forward and grow, and continuing to broaden perspective, understand that everyone has elements that they're bringing to the table to create inclusion and belongingness, and that's really what we're focusing on, is continuing to move forward accordingly.
Just a quick question. You said that in hindsight, you had some internal barriers, right, that prevented you from doing this work. Looking back, do you think most of those barriers, were they indeed internal, or was it external, or?
I kind of struggled a little bit on both sides. When I first entered, so I came into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space from a marketing background. I worked as a full-time marketer for the law firm that I was with, and transitioned into DEI work there via supporting our women's networks. And then I got asked to continue to support more broadly in a formal role. And I found myself in a lot of spaces where I was relatively uneducated, so a little bit of that was internal, and then on the flip side of that, that was recognized by other professionals in the space, and I kind of got pushed out a little bit because I wasn't truly a certifiable diversity professional, if you will. So that's where, for me at least, the education and the learning, and I know I've heard it a couple times today, Google seriously is your friend, really, really makes a difference. There's a book out there, White Fragility, that is great as a starting point if you're not really you want to understand some of those emotions and kind of get through it and continue to move forward accordingly. But I definitely struggled with that, so I attended the diversity bar associations. So if any of you are in the legal space, all of the associated, the LGBT bar, the National Bar Association, the NAPABA, which is the Asian Pacific American Bar Association, I was frequently the only person who was white in the room, which was definitely, for me, a different experience, and in some ways, really gratifying, just to continue to be to take that growth mindset and push and learn and know that everyone who was there had so much to teach me to be able to bring that back to my company and be able to do better and right by our employees.
Thank you. Dr. Chang?
Yeah, so the question is, why is this work hard, or why is it hard to bring it to light? And I would say the summary is that we've come a long ways and we have a long ways to go. And so I think just recognizing that, the history of the women's rights movement, history of human rights and civil rights in this country, and LGBTQ rights has progressed significantly. And yet, when we look at our everyday structures and systems, we know that there's still quite a gap that exists. And so I think it's that recognition of yes, we have traveled a long ways and we have a long journey ahead of us, one that will probably never end. And I think that is probably very challenging for each of us. And kind of circling back to our first keynote speaker from this morning, when Stephanie was saying that we each have really deep work that we have to do in order to move forward in this space. And I think it's that our understanding now around unconscious bias and how we are all ingrained in that because of the society that we grew up with, because of the role models that we have in our lives. And so that part is very uncomfortable, to come to terms with that, and reflecting and figuring out and learning. Google the implicit association test. If you haven't taken it, it's eye-opening. So all those things can really make this very personal, and that's what makes it so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're putting yourself out there, right, in many respects, and sometimes it's that small step that looks like a big leap from where you're coming from. I want to change the topic a little bit about, I think, each of you I've met prior to this coming here today, and in our conversations with you, each of you had mentioned the importance of having conversations, right? Whether those conversations are to convince management that DEI work is worth it, conversations to overcome conflict, or just get, kind of a feel for what's going on in the group that you're working in. what would be your recommendations on starting those conversations, and whether it's one-on-one with a person or with a group of people, and understanding that this can be difficult?
I would start with what I call a landscape analysis. So really doing a survey of your workplace climate or whatever organization you're functioning within, really trying to get a full analysis of where people are, what their baseline understanding is. Are they recognizing that there are inequities within your organization, or that there are power dynamics that dictate who gets to show up, who gets to raise their hand, who gets to do what, and who doesn't, right? And who's not at the table at the first place. And so when I joined my organization, Brink, I did a landscape analysis. Every employee, as a part of my orientation, I just got to know people and just tried to better understand where they were coming from, who they are, where they were coming from, and what they were interested in. And if they were interested in DI work, I learned that many folks were coming from different places across the country, and this was the first time in their workplace that they were actually talking about this type of stuff, and that it was exciting and it gave them a little bit of anxiety, but they were eager to learn. So I took those cues, those social cues of openness, curiosity, wanting to learn more, can you send me that link, as an entry point into, oh, I have some coworkers who are, first of all, amazing, and two, are interested in, and some of them are committed to doing this work outside of our roles and responsibilities that we signed up for when we agreed to work at Brink. So that's one of the strategies that I've done, and because of that, I've been able to create what we call a People of Color Caucus at Brink, which is I've been convening people of color to better understand what's happening on the ground, what are people experiencing that, and I take those communications and those experiences, and I have a direct line to the founders at Brink so I can share out, this is what we're here, this is what I'm hearing, these are some strategies that I think we need to respond to, and these are some things I think we actually need to invest in as an organization, such as training, such as bringing in a facilitator, such as bringing in somebody who does DEI all day long to think about not only how we apply this to our organizational culture, but how is this going to show up in our work as marketers, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can start, but one of the ways that I've found has been really effective is just doing that little analysis, that getting to know your people and figuring out where their strengths are, where the deficits are, and where you can start filling some of those gaps.
I have a follow-up. So that analysis, is it a survey? Is it a conversation? Is it a meeting? All the above? Something else?
As a communications practitioner, I like a good old-fashioned communication, just conversation. It doesn't have to be technical. In fact, I don't think it should be technical because we're talking about people here and their experiences and the identities that they're bringing to you. So I think it's really important to have some authenticity, to have an organic flow, to just really just understand, again, where people are coming from and what they're willing to share and where their boundaries are. It's very important to understand where people's boundaries are too.
So thinking about how to really push, keep the conversation going and making it effective to affect change in the organization, I would say the three things that come to mind are around sponsorship, and then normalizing the conversations and repeat. So when I say sponsorship, think about normalizing this equity, inclusion, diversity, truly adopting, not keeping this as a separate department or a separate program, but making it so that it's work that we embody every day. So to move that, it's a cultural shift. And I think of that as critical because culture starts at the top. So we have to have senior executive sponsorship buy-in to make this work progress. And so I think for those of you in the audience, if you don't have that senior sponsorship already, I think that's probably your best investment in time and energy and effort, is to get your senior leaders on board. I was very lucky because my senior leader, so I report directly to our president and CEO, Dr. Imelda Daconis. When she posted this position, she said specifically, I want the chief people officer to help drive our equity, inclusion, diversity strategy. So she was very clear that she was sponsoring this work and wanted someone who can help really carry out her vision. So I was lucky to step into that role, but when I see that in order to move the needle, we have to have senior sponsorship.
I'm going to interrupt you. What if your senior management or owners of the business aren't buying into it? What do you do? What do you say? I mean, you're fortunate. Not everybody's fortunate that way.
So it's the return on investment, right? Equity, inclusion, diversity is good for the bottom line, period. There's so much research and literature to back that up. So just being business owners, bringing that business case and bringing the literature, I think that is quite convincing.
So making it dollars and cents.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. So we talked about sponsorship. Number 2 then is around normalizing it. So at Northwest Permanente, we, as part of orientation, we have a whole 4-hour course around how to address these microaggressions and hostilities in the workplace. So as soon as we onboard our clinicians and administrators, we're talking about these issues. Then this year we're also going to every department and having discussions, facilitated discussions around unconscious bias. Next year we'll be rolling out an online learning module series around cultural humility. So really it's about making these programs part of everyone's workday. And so it's just expected. This is what you do, and it's part of how we onboard and teach and continue for our professional development as physicians at Northwest Permanente. And then I think that it carries into that third part, which is just repeat and repeat, because this is not a one and done. It's not a singular conversation or one-time workshop that will help bring about this culture change. Is this intentional, systematic way that we will continue to learn together. And so I think that's really how we are approaching this work.
I definitely have to agree with a lot of those components. So I focused on significantly on having conversations with, I called them communication cascades, with different members of our team from the leadership team all the way down, and started with education, looking at the data behind why it's important to have a diverse team within your organization and all of the benefits to doing so. Built that through our communication cascades, and we started by literally analyzing processes that already existed and looking for sort of low-hanging fruit, ways that we could change the process without making large changes to disrupt everyone's sort of way of functioning, to start to enable systematic change. We measured and measured and measured that and had multiple iterations of communication on what that change was, making sure that everyone was complying by it, ensuring that senior leadership was really stepping up and holding people accountable to whatever their portion of that process was, and showing them the results. And we saw some tremendous gains very, very quickly and early on that brought along a number of members of our senior leadership team that were not necessarily on board. I complemented that with 2 other elements. One was the individual education and knowledge perspective, and really bringing research, articles, et cetera, to our employees and leadership rather than asking them to go seek it out. They're busy. It's one of many things they're thinking about. But if I think that it's important and it's going to help them from their perspective, I'm going to share it. Because, hey, if that's the thing that really resonates for them and gets them to start to get on board, then that's a small win in my book. The other thing that we did is we got a little bit further along. We had an executive committee of 7. We assigned each of the members of our executive committee to be a sponsor for one of our employee resource groups. We then told them that they had to not only be a part of the employee resource group internally, but we made them attend the Associated Affinity Bar Association conference to experience what some of the challenges that the particular group that they're supporting are going through, and really connect with our attorneys who are in that space. That was particularly important for us because we had 3,000 employees over 10 offices. So, people didn't see each other all the time, and you're just a face or a name on a list. And we really wanted to try and break that down. So that was really key.
You mentioned when we met that you got some resistance from some of those people that you sent to these conferences, right? What was that resistance? How
Yeah.
how did you convince them to show up? And you said afterwards, most of them had, well, all of them had a 180.
Yeah,
How did that happen?
I was fortunate. I did have a couple of members of the executive committee who were members of our employee resource group, various employee resource groups just inherently, and such supported accordingly. It was still a minority of our overall executive committee, but nonetheless, they helped sort of encourage. I was the one who signed people up to attend, so I got them a ticket and made sure that their assistant booked a flight for them, and they were going. So I did have people who were very resistant. I tried to prepare them as much as possible, providing them with attendee lists, getting them connected to a couple of attorneys that we would have in attendance beforehand, so that they felt like they had some sort of a little sort of insular comfort group at the conference. And I saw inevitably that the people who were most resistant to going were the ones who were the biggest advocates coming back. We also had what we called a triad mentoring program at our organization, which focused on pairing minority senior associates with a mentor who is a more junior partner, as well as a sponsor who's on either the executive committee or a national practice group head. So we kind of supplemented, but by having we had had a lot of success with that and really driving individual achievement within the organization. However, we wanted to have a greater impact, and by really getting people involved at the executive committee level with our affinity groups, not just from the standpoint of the insular nature of our organization, but in the actual communities. We saw incredible buy-in and outreach from those individuals when they went to the different offices to connect with members of those affinity groups, et cetera. And it really took them getting out of their own comfort zone and stepping in someone else's shoes, if you will, from the standpoint of not necessarily attending those conferences themselves, to really get them on board. And that took a lot of guts for some of them. I mean, they were pretty fearful to go ahead and do that. But that was the beauty of it, is they had the power and influence once they had that actual lived experience themselves to really start to advocate.
Great, thank you. Camille. You told me that you were the first person of color hired in your organization. What was going on in your mind as you were considering the offer, and what advice do you have to other managers who may be kind of wanting to diversify their their teams?
Yeah, so I was the first full-time person of color that was employed by Brink, and when I was considering their offer, I was looking at their website, and I was like, oh, all right, this is an opportunity, right? I'm flipping that framework. It's an opportunity for me to come in and potentially transform the organization in the best way that I know how. And so when I sat down with the co-founders, one of the questions that I asked them during our little chat when they were recruiting me, which was, what are you doing to advance equity? What does that look like and feel like to you? And their eyes kind of got big, and they said, well, to be honest, we're open and curious and committed, we just don't know where to start. And I took that as an entry point. That was my little door. So I opened that door and said, awesome, I'm so glad that you guys are open and curious and committed. I'd love to help you think through some strategies if I were to come to work here. Would you be able to resource that? And they said, absolutely. So I think I was very lucky in that I stepped onto fertile ground that was ready. Once I came into the organization, I worked with them to set up some of those strategies and to make sure that they were integrated into the way in which we approach building an organizational culture, but also that it informs the way that we do our work, our praxis, right? Putting theory into practice. And so when I started, I was the only one. And then a year later, when I started, we had 11 employees, and then a year later, we had 26, and 30% of those employees were people of color or identified as LGBTQ. And so I think what the principals or our co-founders, what they needed was to accept and to acknowledge and to nod their head and say, yes, we can do this, and we're willing to put some resources behind it. And even though it wasn't in my job description, this is something that I love to do, and I take it upon myself to do the work if I identify that work needs to be done. And so I was able to kind of figure out, in collaboration with the principals, what are the ways that we can show up more transparently out in the workspace or in the field of recruitment to let other people know that look like me or look similar to me that this is a good place to work, that this is a safe place to work. So one tactical thing that I did is we need to look at our job listings, y'all. Okay, there's nothing about this job listing that says that Brink is committed to or values diversity. So I wrote 2 very simple sentences. Brink not only values diversity, we celebrate it, and we are always looking to create a more inclusive workspace for our employees. We invite diverse candidates to apply for our positions, right? We also set up some meet and greets so that people could actually see who the women of Brink are. We do have a few men, but what a women-founded communications, marketing, design firm looks like. We have these meet and greets. We have been reaching out to our networks, particularly networks that have diverse workforce pools, so they can come in and meet us and see who we are and really confirm for themselves that this is a place where they could show up and be their full selves, right? That was what I always told my principals. As a Black woman, right, living in Portland, I need to be able to show up to work and be my full self. I'm not gonna show up and try to code switch, which means I'm not trying to play into certain stereotypes, right? I need to be able to share with you if I'm having difficulties being at work today because of something that's happened out in the world, right? Because I think people forget that yes, we are creating an inclusive culture in here, but when I walk outside of this office, the world is very different for me. And so we need to recognize that for all of the people that we bring into our workspace. So one of the just tactical strategies and advice I have is make sure that the values that you are trying to communicate to a workforce show up authentically and transparently in all of your communications, on your job postings. When people come into your office, how do you make them feel? How do new candidates feel? Who are they seeing, right? If I'm the only one, they see me. And then if more people come in, they see that there's more people that look like me all of a sudden, and then 30%, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's just really important to think about the ways that you're showing up and how you're communicating your values and your commitments.
Dr. Chang, just kind of compliment of what Camille was saying. You were telling me, tell us a little bit about the recruitment process that you guys start in elementary school, is that right? and kind of achieving some of the same things that Camille was talking about.
Yeah, so building a pipeline, the future physicians. So not quite elementary school, but middle school is where we start. We give them a few years. So we really thought through how can we invest in the communities where we serve, and recognizing that communities of color don't have the mentorship and sponsorship for those kids to get their 150 hours of clinic shadowing even before they can apply to medical school. So those more stringent requirements now to even get into medical school are just really out of reach for certain communities. So we have invested in creating a pipeline program with the Fabian School in North Portland and with Ron Russell Middle School out in East Portland. And it's a program where 7th and 8th graders apply and are selected to join us in a series of hands-on activities where they learn what is it like to be a physician, to work in the healthcare field. And part of it is they come to our hospitals and they take a tour, they come to our clinics, we go to a simulation lab and simulate the birth of a baby and the intensive care unit. So these students really get a lot of hands-on work. They do a casting workshop. They get so excited. And then we also talk about, what are the financial assistance programs that are available for people to apply to. Yes, you can afford college. Yes, you can afford to go to medical school. This is all within reach. So this is a pipeline program that we started 3 years ago and borrowed on Permanente in Southern California, who've had a similar program running for over 12 years now. And so that's beginning of our pipeline. Then we move on to high school. We have a summer high school program in partnership with Kaiser Foundation Health Plan. So we have summer experiences for high school students at Northwest Perm. We also have a college-paid summer internship that we also include clinical shadowing time as part of that, so that the students can build their resume and have an increased chance of getting into medical school. And we're very proud to say that one of the graduates of the summer intern program has now finished dental school and has come back and has signed on to become a Permanente dental associate. So it's starting to pay off. And then the last part of our pipeline is, most recently we started a mentorship program with OHSU School of Medicine. So students who belong in one of their diversity interest groups had asked if we would help mentor them, and because they really wanted to have mentors that looked like them. And we kicked that program off a couple months ago, so we're really excited, and about over 30 students are participating in the program. So we're really thinking through, like, how can we build this pipeline in the future, really increase the diversity of the candidate pool. And so it's certainly a long ways off before we're gonna see the return.
Short of an elementary school.
Yes, it is true. Preschool, that's next, yeah.
Kristin, any other examples where you've seen or participated in helping making the workplace more inclusionary?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm excited to hear that Northwest Permanente has invested dollars that early on. It's hard to convince companies to do that with such a long runway on return on investment, and I'm glad to hear that it's coming around full circle there. So that's fantastic. Sorry, I just, one of the other things that we did do, so as I was listening to you all, I was thinking about just sort of the recruitment into retention component and how best to support that. We did a lot of work on the recruitment side and saw tremendous gains there, but the reality is if people don't feel welcome in your workplace, then they're not going to stick around and you're going to continue to have to go through that process. It's actually much more effective to focus on the retention component. And one of the things that we really did there, the legal industry in and of its nature is predominantly cisgendered white males because of barriers to entry, which is why I'm so excited to hear about what you guys are doing in the medical space. We really focused on allyship and engaging, at least in the short term and interim, is really we developed out a 7-step process that we rolled out across the organization to encourage people to understand how they could show up as allies and make incremental strides there. If anyone's looking at something like that, PFLAG was what I modeled it off of. They have a great, Parents for Lesbian and Gay Children, basically, Parents and Friends, okay, thank you. But anyway, their allyship, Becoming an Ally PDF was a great structure. It needs to be tweaked, obviously, for a broader allyship focus, but I really liked the in-depth analysis that they did, and we did roll that out to get greater support across the organization. It also really helped us from the standpoint of making sure that we didn't tokenize some of our employees to have additional resources. So, you might not necessarily have someone who looks exactly like you, but we're starting to help the people who don't be a little bit less blind, a little bit more open, thinking a little bit more about really stepping up to the plate and not necessarily just going with who looks the most like them and has the most similar background, if you will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's hard to imagine we're at that audience Q&A time. So I think do we have a mic for folks? If people have questions, pass one of these around. I want my mic. We also know that sometimes questions around diversity, equity, inclusion, you might want to stay anonymous. So Matt has postcards. If you prefer to ask an anonymous question, that's totally fine. Fill it out, give it to him, and he'll hand it up to us, and we'll try our best to answer it. So I think there was a hand up here. No? Anybody have any questions? There has to be one question out there. All right, we got one up here. Thank you.
Thank you for your awesome insights. I have a question for all three of you, but particularly Dr. Chang and Kristin, because you guys both mentioned like impact, measuring impact and ROI and presenting that to stakeholders to get like continuous buy-in, to get buy-in in the first place and then continued buy-in. What specific metrics did you use? How did you present that? And what were the discussions that came out of them?
So our metrics, since we're in healthcare, was we're looking at patient-centered outcomes. And really nationally across the Kaiser Permanente program, we're looking specifically in care gap disparities between African American and Latino groups compared to the whole population. So we know that there's an opportunity to improve blood pressure control among African American patients and to also improve diabetes control for the Latino population. And we're proud to say that in the work that we have done, we haven't closed the gap completely, but we have narrowed it significantly. And Kaiser Permanente across the US is really national leading. So across all healthcare industry, we are the ones who've narrowed that gap the most for the particular patient populations. So that to us is our leading indicator of, is our program successful? Because it really speaks, from, are we recruiting physicians who look or speak like the patients that they're serving so that they can build that better rapport and trust? There's lots of research that shows there's better patient outcomes if there's language concordance. Are we delivering the healthcare information in a way that is understandable and following the language and standards? And are we creating a physical space and environment where people can feel safe and comfortable and feel like they're welcome and that they can access? So there's so many factors that go into it, but at the end of the day, it's about care delivery and our patients' outcomes.
Question over there? Got to run the mic.
Hi there. My name's Kim, and I have a question based on a saying that I heard when I used to hire for startups and expansion teams. And the saying is, people tend to hire in their own image. And I found that it was true when people who were doing the hiring weren't well trained. And I was wondering, my question is, what education can be provided to hiring managers that aren't HR, they've never been trained before, about the importance of hiring for diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and not looking at hiring in their own image, so to speak, and sharing that data with companies that it is good for the bottom line, it is good for communities, it is good for productivity to have strong, diverse teams. But where can the education come from? Because what I saw was people who were told to hire and they had no idea how to do it.
So there's a fair amount that needs to be done on the education side. So the IAT that Dr. Chang mentioned is really important. Also doing education regarding hiring best practices. However, beyond the scope of that, one of the things that we did is we actually made changes to our hiring practices, and we did communication cascades. We literally mapped out everyone who touched that process and did what I mentioned earlier, a communication cascade to make sure that everyone was educated on how the process was changing, how that was going to be impacting them, and gave them the space in small enough groups to ask questions, et cetera. The two major changes that we did in that process, which sort of started to kind of force us to move in the right direction, was we followed the NFL's Rooney Rule. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. The NFL's Rooney Rule states that for all head coaching positions, at least one qualified minority candidate be interviewed prior to a hiring decision being made. So we ended up implementing something similar in our organization where we required that before a hiring decision was made and anyone who went through the interview process could get an offer, we had to interview at least one minority candidate who was qualified. That was all the way through the interview process so that people weren't just immediately jumping on opportunistic hires or going with someone who they felt incredibly comfortable with without being pushed out of their comfort zone a little bit in that sense. We saw by making those two changes that in 6 months, and we also ended up doing some of the legwork on helping to broaden the pipeline channels. So we went to the local areas where we had offices and sought out resources in the minority communities that we were involved in to help support us. So that's, you know, local, in our case, those local bar association chapters. And we ended up seeing our hiring of diverse candidates, not including women, because it was labor and employment, which is predominantly women already, go from 34% to 58% in 6 months. So we did that in concurrence with the education component through the IAT, through targeted understanding of how to engage and become aware of where your biases may be in the interview process as well.
I would add also is not only just the education among the hiring managers, but you got to recruit outside your networks, right? Your normal recruiting channels, they're bringing you the people that you're normally used to getting. And if you want to diversify, you're going to have to go outside of those networks and recruit from them. You may not know, when I started recruiting for my existing position, I didn't know where to go. So I started talking to other community groups and saying, hey, I need to hire this person. Where should I go? Right? And they started telling me, or, you know, they told me that this person, you know, Jose, he knows every job seeker that's out there. I'm making it up a little bit, but there are people in the communities that know those resources, so engage with them and recruit outside your normal channels.
I will also say that our biggest naysayers in the process were our recruiting team, because it meant extra work for them. But the reality is most of the work's up front, and once you have those channels developed, it's really not that bad. I promise.
Yeah, you'll use it.
Yeah.
I would also add there are a number of unconscious bias trainings that are available locally. So I would recommend Resolutions Northwest is a great place to start. They are a radical, transformative group of people that are doing affordable sliding scale trainings for organizations every single day. We've partnered with them. And then Western State Center locally is a great resource as well for those types of trainings. Anyone that's hiring or trying to retain talent needs to go through a self-awareness process, a full training, so that they can really uncover some of those unconscious bias and really acknowledge that if you have a leadership team or a hiring team or HR team that is all white, there's some challenges there, right? And you need to acknowledge and accept that, and then you need to figure out strategies, trainings that will help you figure out either how to better reflect the communities that you want to serve as a team, right? And then how to tap into some of these networks. And partnering with community-based organizations, advocate groups is a great way, particularly in Portland, to expand your networks and really cultivate relationships and get access to really high-quality talent that you're looking for. Oh, we're definitely out here.
Yeah, and just one final thought to add is with that sourcing for candidates, it's right, expanding the network within Portland, but also looking outside, because we're lucky that Portland is a very desirable place for people to move to. And so that's our strategy, is that we are investing in 2 additional recruiters who are, their sole responsibility about sourcing, and they're going to source nationally. Because our local medical schools, their classes currently are not as diverse as we would hope to recruit from. You know, so our local pipeline doesn't quite have the array of diversity that we want. And ultimately, is we want a workforce that reflects the community that we serve.
Another question? I'm gonna have to make up one then. Oh, there we go. Kate.
I was wondering if any of you could share examples of internal communication best practices, maybe from a larger organization, as a certified B Corp, especially at Beneficial State, we tend to take pretty clear stances on issues, external issues, doing a lot of activism, et cetera. And often, I think we're still learning how to engage all of our staff on the decisions and the stances that we take, and different employees have different understandings of how things are quote unquote political or not political, and how those translate into diversity, equity, and inclusion, values at the organization at the personal level. And so I just wonder if you have any examples from your organization as you think about, we believe that organizations have to stand up and get involved in activism. Not every B Corp believes that. But when, as a company, you decide to take a issue-based stance related to racial equity or other work, what are the ways in which you engage staff on that decision-making? Just curious, because I think that the internal communications piece can be a challenge when organizations get involved in things that some employees may feel like are political or not, and we're just navigating a lot of that as we take really important stances on issues.
I know you did the city work.
Well, this is kind of a challenging question to answer only because Brink is a political communications firm. So of course, our vehicles are racial and social justice, so we are going to take up those issues. But I think when people are coming from different baseline understandings of why the issue is political or what the injustice is, that's a different type of conversation. So at Brink, we start every project, every entry point to working with a client with full research. So we're going to do a landscape analysis to see what's actually happening in the world, how is the media communicating about it, and what has been the kind of societal response to this issue or challenge. And that helps us as a team really figure out the different perspectives and opinions that are at play that we have to triage, rewrite, rebrand, et cetera. And so one of the issues that we kind of had to broach recently is we are getting into more and more work with building strong relationships with the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon. And so we had to acknowledge and accept that as a firm, we did not have the expertise to do that work. So we cannot center ourselves in projects that are calling for that type of specific work. But what we did do is do some research and better understand what are the implications at stake of having an organization that has no Native or tribal people engaging in that type of work and branding it in the way of community engagement or tribal engagement. And then how do we talk about that dynamic that's in play within our organization? Because we had to register, oh yeah, this is a problem for us. And so we have what we call family talks at Brink during staff meeting about what does it mean when a client is asking us to do this work and we actually do not feel well equipped to do that, that in a way that would produce positive outcomes and reduce harm. So I think one of the strategies that we've talked about is bringing in a neutral facilitator to help us think through where our deficits are. So we've hired consultants to help us think through how do we approach a client like this? How do we make sure that we are reducing harm and creating the type of outcomes that the client is asking for while being culturally responsive and having representation from the communities that we're trying to serve. So we know we can't do this work unless we hire and resource Native American, Alaskan Indians, or tribal people as a part of this work. They will be our consultants. They will provide the strategic direction. We cannot do it otherwise, right? So I think hiring a facilitator to help us flesh out what we're actually trying to do and whether it's political or not political, whether it's for the better good or whether we step out of it completely and ask somebody else to take it on our behalf that's better equipped is some of the things that I've seen come into play in our conversations at Brink.
I would just agree. I mean, it seems kind of straightforward, but make sure that those who would be most impacted are included in that conversation and are taking part in helping craft that communication as well. I have seen that not happen and it's backfired. So, yeah.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, or not even 5 minutes left, but parting thoughts, words. Any thoughts that you may have shared or want to emphasize with the audience or that you haven't covered yet? I want to go first.
Parting thoughts. I would just say I've been having lots of conversations with different community groups, and there's so much work to be done, and it feels really, really big. It feels huge. It is huge, actually. And so I've been thinking about what are the tiny baby steps that each person can take every single day to move the work forward. And something that I've committed myself to is just facilitating more authentic conversations, right? I work in the digital world as a marketer. I'm trying to craft copy that, cuts through the clutter of what everybody's seeing on their social media feeds. That's fine. But what I really want to do is hear somebody else's story. Right? I want to tap into people's lived experiences. I want to share my own lived experiences because I think storytelling is a very powerful tool in this work, right? And I think that we can just start by, igniting those small conversations, digging a little deeper, interrogating, agitating the system that we're trying to dismantle in very small and graceful ways that allows people to think and more deeply consider how they live and how others live that are adjacent to them, that are literally your next door neighbors, right? How is my experience different than yours? And what can you do to lend yourself to lean in, to think through how you can make a place or a space better for somebody that looks like me, that resembles me, for the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. Because we created the system, we have to dismantle it together.
Not much to add there. I'll just circle back to the beginning. I talked about sponsorship, and I saw some head nods in the audience. So I would say if you feel like your CEO or your COO is not bought in, then that's the first conversation for you to go back and have that. So put yourself out there and show them the literature, show them the business case of why equity, inclusion, diversity is so important and good for your bottom line. So that's my ask of you.
I would say with each process, change, et cetera, that you are working on in your company, make sure that you are consistently aiming to look at it through a lens of equity. And that goes beyond HR. I know Camille touched on the marketing component of it a little bit, the website, et cetera. It's so pervasive, and the idea is to continue to move forward even in small steps every day. Your work will never be done. You will continue growing. That's good. So keep working towards that.
Yeah, and I just would say, again, take small steps. As I started 5 years ago, I had a lot of apprehension. I was excited about the work I was doing, but I had some apprehensions. And today, I'm much more comfortable. I'm not perfect. This is complicated work. This work constantly grows and gets, bigger and bigger. But I feel much more confident and capable of having these conversations. And it all starts with small steps. So take that step. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but know that you're not alone. And most people, they'll appreciate what you're trying to do and kind of support you. So with that, thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists, Kristin, Dr. Chang, and Camille for being here and sharing your wonderful wisdom and thoughts and experiences with us. I think all of us will be around afterwards at some point, so feel free to engage with us if you have any other questions. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the event.